Hey guys, welcome to TCR. Thanks for clicking on the video. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Today we're going to talk about some of the basics of getting yourself some birds and what to expect. So let's talk about some of the basics of what to think about or what to expect when you're going to get some birds. The first thing that you want to think about when you're contemplating starting a flock is, do you want to start with eggs that you're going to incubate, or do you want to start with chicks? Or do you want to start with older birds that are already, pullets, or maybe somebody that's rehoming some birds? So I'll give you some of the pros and cons of both. Obviously, if you have an incubator and you want to incubate your own eggs, if you can get them from a friend locally or someone locally, that's probably going to be ideal. Having eggs shipped, you do run the risk of them being damaged in transit, of the air sac in the egg becoming detached. If you do decide to ship eggs because maybe there's a specific breed that you want, just make sure that when you do receive the eggs that you let them settle for 24 hours before you put them in the incubator. This will help the air sac reattach inside the egg, and it will help the chick to have a better chance at developing fully. Getting chicks is always the route that I went. I just thought it was a lot easier. You're going to pay a little bit more, obviously, than if you're just getting eggs that you're going to then incubate. But you know that at least you're getting a bird, you're guaranteed, at least you're starting out with a few chicks. Whereas with eggs, you don't know what the fertility rate's going to be. So sometimes that can be a little bit up in the air. Starting with chicks, they do sometimes die in the first few days. It's just nature. Sometimes there's just something wrong with the chick, and a chick won't make it for very many days. So when you're buying chicks, always get a couple extra, because you might lose one or two. And if you're talking about maybe only keeping about 5 hens, that can be a big difference. So you do want to kind of think about that. There is a chance that you could lose 1 or 2 birds. Things happen when they're babies like that. You're not out in the brooder with them 24/7. So it's if you're starting from scratch, you do want to make sure you get a couple more birds than you anticipate actually wanting to have, because at the end of it, if all the birds make it, 2 or 3 extra birds isn't really going to be that big of a difference as far as the strain on your environment. So if you've gotten chicks, that means you now have to do what we call brooding them. Chicks aren't feathered out yet, and it'll take a few weeks before they're ready to be outside on their own, to where they're big enough and feathered out where they can keep their own body heat. Chicks need to have a constant source of heat, and if you don't have a mother hen that's raising up your birds, then you do need a heat lamp, or they do make those little kind of like heat stands that can go in there that you plug in, that are supposed to be a little bit more cost effective. Most people generally use those if they're brooding indoors, like in a container in their garage or in a spare room or something. But I've always used heat lamps, and I brood my babies outside. We have a little setup next to our chicken run, and I use that for quarantining birds occasionally. Like right now, I've got 2 drakes in there that have been naughty, that are going to go to winter camp very shortly. Because I don't have any chicks. But when I do my meat birds, and when I have any laying hens, or the first couple batches of ducks that I threw in there, I've got the heat lamp on. You do want to think about the fact that these are smaller birds. So generally your feeders and your waterers, you want to get ones that are geared towards chicks, like the screw top lids and the feeders that have the little holes for them to poke through. Those are ideal. They're not completely necessary. I have trained my birds pretty young, especially if I have older birds in there with them, to drink out of my watering system, where they kind of toggle the little switch, and they usually get the hang of it pretty quick. But I'll usually put another dish of water in there for them just to make sure, until they get the hang of it. But if you're starting from scratch, again, you will want to get the screw top jar with the little round pan underneath it, that you can get at any feed supply store or Amazon, and that way you can make sure that your chicks aren't going to get too wet. They're not going to drown in their water. You don't want to just stick a big old bowl of water in there and hope that they learn how to swim and keep themselves warm, because that is, a chick getting cold and wet is their biggest nemesis. You want to make sure that they have, fresh bedding in there. I like to use pine shavings, and that'll keep them nice and warm. You want to make sure, of course, your heat lamp is off, away from the any wood or plastic or touching anything, because those heat lamps, well, they're hot. That's why they're called heat lamps. And they will start a fire if you put things next to them that are flammable or meltable or whatever. And you don't want it too low to the ground anyway, because you'll pre-cook your chickens, and you don't want to do that. What are you going to feed your babies? That's an important thing. Chicks don't eat quite the same way that mature or birds that are old enough to be outside will. Birds that are old enough to be outside have the ability to forage and get some grit, and that helps them break down their food. So you do want to make sure that you get a feed, whatever kind of feed you decide to get them, that is made for younger birds or made for all ages. There are some that are like that, that it will just depend on if there's certain amounts of calcium or protein or whatever that you want to check the label for. I use a broiler crumble for mine, which is actually what you feed your meat birds. There's no calcium added to it like there is with laying feed, and it has a higher protein level like the chicks need. The funny thing about that is that the brand of feed that I use, they have the same exact formula is also called their chick starter. So I'm like, I'll just buy the same thing. It's the same stuff. So that's actually a really easy cheat that I do with my king feed, which is a local feed here. So if you're watching this and somewhere else other than Southern California, you're not going to be able to get that feed. But you do want to make sure that you get a healthy chick feed. I do not recommend giving medicated feed to chicks. I don't personally like to vaccinate birds. Sometimes when you get them from just a local feed store, they'll already be vaccinated. If you order them directly from a hatchery like McMurray, they will ask you at checkout if you want your birds vaccinated or not for certain things. It's up to you. It's personal choice. If you have certain things in your area or that your neighbor has had a problem with or whatever, then you might want to think about it. But personally, I don't like to give medicated feed to my birds. Medicated feed is really not good can't give it to ducklings. And with chickens, I don't like to medicate anybody if they're not sick. So I try to stay away from that. But again, that's your own personal choice. My personal advice would be skip the medicated feed, give them a good, healthy chick starter or a chicken feed that is, also listed for chicks, and you'll have to check locally what you have available, but definitely think about what you're going to be giving them. Now, you can get chickens at almost any time of year, but the preference is to start in the spring. That's a natural time for them to be hatching. It's a natural time for them to acclimate to the weather, so they won't be too hot right off the bat. And it's just, that's how nature does it. So I personally like to kind of keep it to that time frame. Now here in Southern California, that means we generally start in about February. I usually get my first clutch. My girls start laying and sitting usually around the beginning of February. Sometimes they'll start sitting the end of January if they're really excited. But when I order birds, I usually order my first batch of meat birds to come the first week of February, sometimes the end of January, and they go right into the brooder. And same thing with regular chicken breeds that are laying hen breeds. They're usually going to be ready if you start them in, depending on where you are, you'll have to see, maybe you have to wait till March because you're still iced over in February. Generally, somewhere, depending on the breed, somewhere between 8 to 12 weeks, those birds will be able to be outside on their own. Some of them will feather out faster. As they're in the brooder over those weeks, I always raise the heat lamp up every week or every few days, depending again on how the weather's doing, how the birds are looking, how they're reacting to it, so that I'm actually decreasing the temperature and not keeping them quite as warm. You can kind of force them to feather out a little bit faster and mature a little bit faster by doing that. And then they'll be ready to go outside. when they make that transition, because my brooder is right next to my coop, my birds that I already have can see the kids in the brooder. So I don't have to do really a waiting period or transition or anything. I do go ahead and lock everybody up for about 2 to 3 days once I put them out in the run, just so that I don't have to go for an Easter egg hunt and try to find the birds at bedtime. They know to go up into the coop on their own. At that point, they realize that's home and they're good to go. Another thing to think about is, do you want a rooster? Some people don't. They're adamant about it, or they live in an area where they're not zoned to have roosters, and that's okay. When you order your birds or when you get them at the feed store, you can always ask them, are these sexed? Are they straight run? Straight run means you got a shot, 50-50 shot of it being a boy or a girl. These have not been checked. If you get a sexed group, or they sell them and it says pullets, pullets is a term used for birds that are presumed to be female from their best checking. They've usually vent checked the bird, so they actually squeeze the bird, which I don't recommend doing. It can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing to the birds. Don't go outside and start squeezing your baby birds. But they'll do a vent check at the hatchery and separate them out so that they know, that these are pretty much guaranteed that these are pullets. Although I had 2 that were out of guaranteed pullets groups this year that ended up being roosters, but that's all right. Pullet just means that it's presumed to be female, and it's usually means up to the point of lay under a year. So usually most breeds will start laying somewhere between 5 to 7 months. Your colored egg layers, your Americanas, your olive eggers, they usually go more towards 7 months. But your Barred Rocks and your Delawares and your Orpingtons and your Rhode Island Reds, all those guys are generally going to start laying around the 5-month mark. So you can kind of keep an eye on that. They'll look like mature birds at that point. They'll be fully feathered out, of course. They'll be mostly feathered out, but they go through that awkward teenage stage from about 12 to 16 weeks up until they're about 20, 24 weeks. And then you'll kind of say like, oh, okay, they look mature now. So deciding if you want a rooster, having a rooster means that your eggs now, you basically have to think of them as all being fertilized. Yes, your roosters will protect your flock. Sometimes they will be a little rough on your girls. You do want to make sure that if you are going to decide to keep a rooster, that you do want to have a good ratio of girls to boys in your group so that nobody gets, a little too, popular. That's a good way to put it. Nobody gets a little too popular on the farm. You want it equal distribution so that nobody's getting beat up too badly, because some of those roos can be a little tough. And I've had some roos out here that have been very tough on my girls, and they don't last very long out here. And then I've got some roos that are very gentle with the girls, and they get to stick around and do their thing. So, and it's not always the prettiest birds. It's not always the roosters that I'm like, oh, I want to continue that line. But sometimes that's just the way it goes. The nice guys do sometimes finish first. So that's a few chicken basics for you. If you're starting from scratch, get yourself a few hens. I always recommend, if you're starting from scratch, get 6 hens, at least, minimum. I prefer 12 to start with, but get at least 6. You might lose 1 or 2. That still leaves you with a decent grouping together so they can have a small flock. Figure out when you want to get, or if you want to get rather, a rooster or not. If you want to just only have girls, you don't want to ever try to incubate eggs. People are always getting rid of roosters. You can always find a rooster for free a lot of times in your area. So it's later down the road, if you decide you want one rooster, you can find one. Just hop on Facebook. You'll find somebody with a rooster that they want picked up. Think about the time of year. I prefer to start, in May. I prefer to start in the spring for my birds. But again, depending on your area, that might mean May for you. And that might mean, because of the way your weather is, maybe you've got a window of May to July, So you might want to think about that, and then think about, how long would I actually have to have the heat lamp on. I usually, if I start them late enough, I can usually get them to a point where the heat lamp's off during the day. They're still in the brooder because they're not quite big enough to be outside, but it gets the job done. So that's my take on a few basic things that if you're contemplating getting chickens, that you should kind of be aware of or think about, and maybe plan, how you want to set it up, how you want to do it, what situation or what scenario works best for you as far as getting yourself some pullets and setting up your brooder, what you're going to feed them, if you want a rooster, lots of things to think about. Remembering how long they'll be in the brooder before you can transition them to being outside, to free range, or in the coop and all of that. So that's it for my birdie basics. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell so you get the notifications, and go shop for some chickens.